This FedGov Today program is sponsored by Maximus. On this edition of FedGov Today, the future of Maven Smart System as it becomes a program of record at the Pentagon.
At the end of the day, whether you're an intelligence professional, an operations professional, or especially a commander, you're interested in reducing entropy, in reducing all of the dilemmas that you're dealing with and ultimately making a decision.
We're used to looking at human-machine collaboration in a very hardware-driven way, and the world has changed so much that we don't quite figure out what right looks like with this idea of human-machine integration.
Former NGA Director Trey Whitworth and former JAIC Director Jack Shanahan on FedGov Today in just a moment. Uniting program strategy, advanced technology, process, and execution for a more efficient government. That's Maximus. Every program, every service, every time. That's innovation forward. Learn more at maximus.com/federal. Maven Smart System will become a program of record at the Pentagon by the end of this fiscal year, according to the Deputy Secretary at the Pentagon. Steve Feinberg writes that moving MSS to a program of record will, quote, help mature this critical AI-enabled system from a promising initiative into an enduring, joint, and fully supported capability. Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan, U.S. Air Force retired, is former director of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center and former director of the Project Maven Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team. Vice Admiral Trey Whitworth, U.S. Navy retired, is CEO of R4 Federal. He's former director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Maven moved to NGA during his tenure as director. Gentlemen, welcome. It's great to have both of you here. Jack, I start with you. If Maven was not a program of record, what was it when you had it at the JAIC? Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. It's been a little bit of a while since we've talked, so really good to see it. And I can't think of a better person to be talking with today on this subject than Trey Whitworth, who lived this as much as I lived it. So it's a very important and I think very entertaining discussion to follow. The best way I could put it is it was not a program of record in our early days, as you would expect, because it did not exist until 2017 to 2018. What this will segue into in a minute is why a program of record is so incredibly important, mostly on the funding stability side. And Trey will talk about that both at NGA as a Maven program of record, and then I think we both could talk about Maven Smart System as a program of record. But back in those days, we fought for every dollar we could get. We had no funding when we started this program. I will never forget, almost like it was yesterday, the number 2 in the department at the time, Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work, directed the comptroller of the department to find us some money. Without getting into the arcane topics of below and above threshold reprogramming. In short, he said, they have no money. This is one of our highest priorities. Find them the money. I mean, it was difficult because that meant somebody wasn't getting some funding, or some funding was sitting unobligated, and it was just a matter of getting it to us. Then we had to explain to Congress why this was so important, which turned out to be a little bit easier than maybe some of the battles internal to the Pentagon, because Congress, in a very bipartisan way, was very helpful in trying to support the program. But there was not stable funding in those early days. Everything that we were trying to do would come out of the Maven program that was not a program of record. So if a combatant command wanted something, we would have to find additional funding to do that, which was always our goal. That's what makes this so difficult, is you're always trying to come up. I know I'm going to say scrape for money when we're talking tens of millions of dollars. Maybe not everybody agrees with the word scrape, but that's what we felt like we were doing. And by the way, Francis, by the time I got to the Joint AI Center, it was the same way. We didn't have funding at first. We had to build this program as a program of record, and then you start having more stable funding. You have funding lines assigned to you. Life gets a lot better. Still not easy in terms of getting approval from the appropriators, but at least as a program for the department, we felt on much more solid ground. That really never happened until about the end of my time at Project Maven, but it happened eventually.
Trey, I fast forward from the 2016-2017 timeframe that Jack mentioned to November 2nd, 2023. I read from defensedaily.com, under the smiling face of one Vice Admiral Frank Whitworth, the Pentagon's Project Maven is becoming a program of record under the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. NGA said November 2nd, It's formally designated NGA Maven as a program of record effective November 7th, 2023, leveraging the software acquisition pathway. What's the difference between NGA Maven as a POR in November 2023 and Maven Smart System as a program of record March 2026? Welcome, Trey.
Thanks, Francis. And I, too, will share the same enthusiasm for this conversation. I'm honored, especially to be with Jack Shanahan, because we had to start somewhere, and he just had a great review of it. Wasn't necessarily easy. It was a great idea to have a project Maven. I got the easy part in a way of this decision taken by the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security to say, okay, enough with the building enthusiasm in both business communities and in the defense community. Now let's make this real. And NGA, over to you. What we did is we did put a term, words matter. So Maven Smart System is a software suite. We put a term out for the entire enterprise that supports Maven Smart System. And that term was NGA Maven, because obviously we had responsibility for this transition into a program of record, but also because you have to go for the hardest thing first. And we have to kind of review for any of our listeners who aren't familiar with the targeting cycle. Targeting involves, it's basically a business cycle, but you have to have terms that mean things for our warfighters. So it starts with commander's objectives. It moves into target development, which is very, very important here. And then it moves into things like capabilities analysis, a decision and force application, ultimately the execution, and then you assess yourself and you start the cycle over. What we were finding, especially in the intelligence community, was we needed a place to put all your stuff, especially in that target development phase of the targeting cycle, where you're amassing, especially the visual imagery, which is what NGA is calling is the visual domain. And that's really, really dense stuff. Okay, when you think about, you take a picture in your camera and you accidentally have it on high res, and you try to send it and it doesn't go anywhere, that's the dilemma of how dense the files are in imagery. Of course, we want corroboration and other forms of intelligence, and Maven was able to do and is able to do that. But at the end of the day, this is why the initial decision was, okay, NGA, you have these dense files, you have this dense infrastructure. Now you need to be the one to take this program that had been a project and make it a program of record. That's why we intentionally used the term NGA Maven, so that we were not being specific just to the software suite, which is MSS. That was the first application of the software acquisition pathway to be validated by the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, otherwise known as the JROC, so that then we were cooking. At that point, the imperative was on us to be accountable for every dollar that went into, at least for this phase of Maven, which is the visual phase for targeting, that we had good accountability and ultimately good results. And the agility of the program itself, and I would say the stick-to-itiveness that had been started by Jack Shanahan and the team at the JAIC, led right into the same attitude and ethos at NGA. And that's why when I departed, we had every service and every combatant commander actually believing in and using the application that is Maven.
Does it make sense then for me to think of this as the declaration of Maven Smart System as a program of record as the next logical step in the life cycle of Maven more broadly? Is that fair? Either one of you can answer that.
I'll be very interested in what Jack thinks. I think he and I probably are like-minded here, which is it does make sense, because now you're talking about a specific application that does need to be consistent in standards and in the application of funds, especially the accountability of funding, so that we can actually go to our board of directors, which is the United States Congress, and say we are using these funds appropriately, and then have metrics with consistency. But I'll defer to Jack, see what he says.
I agree completely. This is why when I said earlier the funding stability piece was probably the most important. That is the natural progression of every program. That now Maven Smart System is deployed pretty much everywhere around the globe. But let's just say in places where it's not fully integrated yet, a combatant commander doesn't have to figure out necessarily how they're going to come up with their own funding for it. There is a program of record, and I'm guessing that will be worked out with the Chief Digital and AI Office, the OSD CDAO, who is now taking some of that responsibility, some portions of that overall program back from the NGA into that. I think part of that is to have this global responsibility for a system that is beginning to move beyond just sort of this early targeting piece of it. But I will say one other thing, Francis. It's very interesting to me that in the memo that talked about the program of record designation, which I don't think becomes official till September of this year, I believe. But it was in that same memo, it talked about joint all-domain command and control. So as somebody that's been on the inside a little while, I interpreted that memo, we'll see if Trey has a different interpretation, as at least the signs are for a system of Maven Smart System, generally known as a decision support system, could be on path to be designated as one of the key programs of joint all-domain command and control. Changing it from decision support to command and control may seem a little bit kind of inside baseball to your average listener, but for me and Trey, I think that's a very strong signal, and the implications of that would be enormous. If you think the company is locked in as Maven Smart System, if they end up kind of being the center of attention for joint all-domain and command and control, that would be a very interesting future ahead. So it's just I was very fascinated by the fact that those two programs were mentioned in the same memo.
Trey, does that make sense to you?
I see exactly what Jack is getting at here. At the end of the day, whether you're an intelligence professional, an operations professional, or especially a commander, you're interested in reducing entropy, in reducing all of the dilemmas that you're dealing with and ultimately making a decision. And that means, and to kind of go back to, one of the things that a lot of people would say about Maven was we're reducing it to a single pane of glass. And that, in a way, what started as a way to at least accumulate and I would say display a lot of intelligence at one time, suddenly it started dawning on everyone, this is reducing entropy for commanders. And so this is a natural progression towards acknowledging, yes, for C2, command and control, other people call it mission command, whatever, the fact that you now have something that satisfies everyone and reducing entropy, both in intelligence and operations and command. This is important.
Structurally, Trey, Jack alluded a moment ago to the fact that CDAO will have jurisdiction here, most likely. Does that make sense for that to transition there from NGA, given what all of the pieces are that this will include?
I'll start. And so I haven't talked to the current leadership of NGA because, everybody's really, really busy in the current world right now. I look at this right now as a way, a progression, probably a progression, but I would not view it as an exclusion of the rest of that important enterprise, especially in the way of acknowledging NGA's role for infrastructure and I would say the development of models that just continually get better and better and better at this very difficult thing called positive identification.
Jack, you mentioned CJAD C2. What's the intersection of that with this, and what's the implication for CJAD C2 moving forward?
Well, yeah, I'll pick up right where Trey left off, because this is exactly, we talk in very similar language. The idea of, you'll hear terms like single pane of glass. What Maven was beginning to show, even in those sort of early days of 2018, 2019-ish, was the idea of a common intelligence picture. And then interestingly enough, a common operational picture, right? What we found is the special operators who didn't have, you and I, Francis, have probably talked about this before in this program, didn't have some of the habit patterns of the Intel side, decided they kind of liked this and wanted to tailor it for their own use. What you ended up having is what we would call a SIP-COP, Common Intelligence Picture, Common Operational Picture, both tailored to the user's needs. That's the beauty of Maven Smart System. You really get to tailor it to individual user needs. Now, if you've already got, let's say, 150 different sources of information and intelligence being fed into this, at what point, this is exactly what Trey was getting at, is at what point are you able to do command and control if you get the right sources of information and intelligence? That's going to be the big question. Is it ability to do sensor to shooter, which was really at the core of JADC2? I think what we're seeing right now in combat operations is it's exactly what it's doing. In some cases, it's accelerating that sensor to shooter timeline. The challenge has always been across the military services is getting all the services to be interoperable with different sources of targeting data, different sources of information. NGA built all that in the form of their ontology and structured observation, object management, object-based production stuff that Trey lived firsthand. I just was in a lot of those conversations. If you're able to do that effectively, you're now making a very smooth transition from an intelligence operations picture to be able to do authority and direction over assigned and attached forces. But that means it has to be designated as a C2 platform as opposed to a decision support platform. I don't know if Trey want to add anything else to that.
I think that's really well stated. At the end of the day, if it's agile, and this, I think, as we start talking about where to take this in the future and avoiding any sort of pitfalls, we're just, one of the calling cards of this particular suite was its agility, to be able to actually have an individual listen to someone let's say at the last tactical mile who says, I need the following tonight within this suite. And it was Agile code that was able to make that adjustment. We need to make sure that we don't fall prey to sometimes an over control of digits that might forfeit that agility. I think if we look in the past, there have been a couple of declarations of weapon systems that probably people regret. They kind of wish they hadn't declared that a weapon system. As long as we keep the agility so that we reduce entropy and allow warfighters to get the job done, then we're on a good path.
All right, you were exactly right, Trey. The next thing I wanted to talk about is where to take this in the future. And what, you don't have crystal balls, I know, but let's pretend you have crystal balls. What do you see, Trey, moving forward in the next year to 2 years as this becomes a program of record, as it becomes more integrated, as the push across the department for artificial intelligence in all areas of operation becomes more and more in demand?
The possibilities here are endless because the technology continues to improve in artificial intelligence that helps humans. At the end of the day, we're still going to have humans who have standards, and will enforce those standards. We will have rules of engagement. We will have laws of armed conflict. We will have the things that keep us grounded. But we're going to, if we're learning people with inquiring and discerning hearts, we're going to yearn for improvements at every step of that targeting cycle that I mentioned in an earlier section of this discussion. So just imagine allowing technology, if you're a commander, to maybe red team some of the objectives and guidance that you give and are constantly thinking, do I need to adjust my guidance? Just think also, as we start applying this to available resources and being predictive with analytics as to what is my shot doctrine and what impact is that having on my logistics team as to what I might need to bring into my theater at the current rate? Do I need to change my doctrine? Do I need to ensure that the logistics team is actually being predictive and getting more assets to where I am? These are, now you're getting into, and I know that I want to give some time to Jack because I think he feels very strongly. When you get into the reasoning of alternatives and affording even better choices in every step of the targeting cycle, that's very exciting.
Jack, you were nodding quite avidly when Trey was talking about the fact that possibilities are endless. Why does that make you so enthusiastic, that idea?
My own personal taxonomy, for what it's worth, is I always looked at AI in the military in kind of four big stages. The first was perception, and that's what Maven was at its core, perception. Then we started thinking about how to add context in. Hit and miss at the time about how we could try to see what was happening in imagery and try to make some conclusions based on natural language processing at the time. The third one for me is reasoning, and the fourth, which is very advanced, and we're beginning to see signs of that with agency. So I call it agency. But let's focus on the reasoning part of it. By now attaching large language models, or what I would say are frontier models. Right now, it happens to be Claude with Maven Smart System, but it could be any of the frontier models. You're adding in an extremely powerful reasoning layer. I'm not going to claim human agency or human reasoning. It's not the same, but it is a very powerful combination of taking all the different sources of information you're getting into Maven Smart System and trying to make sense of it beyond a human trying to sort through it themselves. Now you're doing what can you use those models to say, the predictive piece of it? Why am I seeing what I'm seeing? And now the next piece of this is, and what do we do about it? It's immature right now, and it's nascent, but I'll tell you, the idea of playing around with this more and more, sandbox environment, whatever you want to call it, I think this is going to be a very powerful combination of taking anything else of the traditional kinds of forms of AI and now adding this frontier model on top of it. I think is one of the next big things. And then you start talking about AI agents getting more sophisticated. A lot more work needs to be done in that. But I think the reasoning piece of this has accelerated a lot faster than I thought it would just 18 months ago.
Well, and that's actually, I guess, the plus and the minus of that whole concept, Jack, is all of this is happening much faster in all aspects of AI than anybody ever expected, than anybody would have thought 12, 18, 24 months ago. Is that fair to say?
It's very fair to say, and I think Trey and I, not to put words in his mouth, but we both like to see this training and education to happen before it's deployed in combat for the first time, because it is going to be so powerful. The more you can do in the peacetime environment to play around with these tools, modeling a simulation, exercises, war games, experiments, the better off we're going to be, because they're so different. Using ChatGPT or its equivalent in our personal lives is significantly different than using it for intelligence and operational decision making. And we've got to get, I think, the education and training pieces and the governance are the next steps to try to figure out how to use it.
Trey, what are the components of an effective education and training regime that will give people the tools that they need to use these effectively in a warfighting scenario?
Well, let me at least begin with where we started in the personnel we assigned to Maven, into NGA Maven. And it was it gets into this seeking collaboration with technology. And I think that is still the human spirit of wanting to improve is going to be at the forefront of the training piece. So as we prepared people to touch this code and to touch this enterprise, we established something called GREAT, and that was GeoInt Responsible AI Training, and it effectively was just reminding everybody of those boundaries that we were speaking to just a few minutes ago. You do have some guardrails. It's known as the rules of engagement. You have these from the beginning. These are based on solid principles, sometimes involving just war or laws of armed conflict, and we keep people grounded and ultimately would make them take a pledge that they were going to adhere to those things. The military is still trained on these principles, and obviously every situation will be different, and that will be the commander-in-chief's prerogative if he's going to change anything. So that is going to be kind of something that those are going to be principles that won't change. But ensuring that you create people who want to always improve and to seek even better solutions and decisions for those commanders, that just reminds us of seeking collaboration, in this case, as Jack was saying, with agents, which is new and different, but actually kind of the same when you think about we were always wanting to collaborate with humans at all times and not just be single sourced.
Yeah, that terminology, Trey, is interesting to me because when you first said it a moment ago, I jotted it down quick, and it makes me think that technology is almost like a person's name when you think about the way that you're describing how a person in government will seek collaboration with, fill in the blank, in this case technology, in another case it might be some other human in another organization or their own organization.
That's right. It gets to the collaborative spirit, and we all seek corroboration. We seek confidence, improving our confidence. And that, given the speeds that some of these models and agents are going to be able to generate, that's beyond the bounds of what we could have done as humans. And so we are very excited about that, if we can actually make better decisions faster. But I defer to Jack for his thoughts.
No, I would just say that everything we're saying here helps underscore my strong emphasis on what we need is a human-machine integration renaissance, because we're used to looking at human-machine collaboration in a very hardware-driven way, and the world has changed so much that we don't quite figure out what right looks like with this idea of human-machine integration. And I think it's very context-dependent. It's based on urgency. It's based on risk. It's based on complexity of the mission. It's never going to be linear anymore. It's going to be this very moving target of where humans dominate, where machines dominate. I see cases of both, but we have to figure out what that means. I just think we're going to have to look at this whole idea of human-machine design differently just to do everything that Trey was just describing.
Gentlemen, there's a lot more I'm sure that we could cover, but I'm very grateful to both of you for the opportunity to talk with you about this, and I imagine we'll connect moving forward. I hope so, and I appreciate your time today, both of you.
Thank you, Francis.
Thank you, Francis. Thanks, Trey.
Thanks, Jack.
You can read more about Maven in all its iterations on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. 5 leaders in the Air Force are the first portfolio acquisition executives for the service. The Air Force is establishing the PAEs to execute on Secretary Hegseth's acquisition reform orders. The military deputy to the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, Lieutenant General Luke Cropsey, tells you how it'll work on this week's FedGov Today TV. The new show's out now. You can watch on demand on the FedGov Today YouTube channel and at fedgovtoday.com. The next FedGov Today podcast is coming Thursday. The CIO of the Pentagon's Cyber Crime Center, Eric Oliver, is here. I'm Francis Rose. I'll talk to you then. Thanks for listening.